Thank you, President Banana. I am honored to introduce Mark Arnold. 3 weeks ago, he was at the front in Ukraine. He returned home to Columbus the day before Thanksgiving. His career in the United States Army spans 37 years, beginning as a private E1 in an airborne Pathfinder detachment. He graduated from the Army's Special Forces Qualification Course, was commissioned as an infantry officer, and transferred to Special Forces, known as the Green Berets. He would do 3 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. Among his positions were Commander, Coalition Special Operations Forces in Afghanistan, Operations and Liaison Officer to Special Missions Units in Iraq, Assistant Chief of Staff, U.S. Army Special Forces. While staying in the Army Reserves, he worked in manufacturing companies. At GE Aircraft Engine, 10 years, Advanced Drainage Systems, 14 years, rising to be one of its top executives. Recruited by Lubrizol to head one of its global units, and then recruited to be president and CEO of GSE Lining Technologies, which he took to a successful public offering and a listing on the New York Stock Exchange. Then he left civilian employment, returned to active duty with the U.S. Army, promoted to commanding general, U.S. Army's 100th Division, the historic Century Division. Along the way, he studied, earned degrees, bachelor's at Ohio University, MBA at Cleveland State, master's in strategic studies at the U.S. Army War College. Footnote: Ohio University has more than 250,000 graduates. Each year, it picks one, just one, to be recognized as its outstanding alumnus. 4 years ago, Mark Arnold was so honored. It turned out his career was just beginning. Russia invaded Ukraine. Mark Arnold went to the front in Ukraine. That's Special Forces background. The first of several trips, 4 trips, that in fact. At the beginning of the war, Russia destroyed 4 of the 5 training facilities in Ukraine for medics, and more than 20,000 new medics had to be trained. The equipment to train them was gone. The result, over half the Ukrainians who have died from their injuries could have been saved if the medics were thoroughly educated and equipped. Mark Arnold decided to make that happen. He founded Frontline Ukraine Medical Fund at the Columbus Foundation. It buys and ships to Ukraine the medical equipment its Army needs to train and equip its medics. He is a warrior saving lives. Fellow Rotarians and guests, please welcome an extraordinary leader, an American hero, General Mark Arnold.
Thank you, Scott. Okay. So yes, I've been to Ukraine 4 times, and I want to say Ukraine looks and feels like Ohio, just so that you have some context. I've driven all over the country, from the west to the east, north, south, been at the front lines during each of my 4 visits. Each visit, this past visit was only 3 weeks. The other visits were 4 to 5, 6 weeks. But Ukraine, the terrain, the highway system, the density of towns and cities to rural areas, driving up and down highways, you see John Deere dealerships. It looks and feels like Ohio. Its temperature, its climate, everything. Margot, are we ready? So this presentation I've got is very much a presentation. I'm trying to advance the slide. All right. I will talk. So Ohio does not have this going on. So this photograph, so I'm afraid instead of paying attention, you can listen to my voice, but please draw your attention to the screen here. So if you can turn around in your chairs, it'll be a lot more comfortable for you. So I was in Ukraine last September during the Eastern counteroffensive. I left at the end of September, returned at the end of October, and coincidentally, the Southern counteroffensive began just 6 days after I arrived. My last day in Ukraine last year was the last day of November. And this cruise missile strike that you see, this is the result of a cruise missile strike. Just 3 blocks from my hotel, the target was a power generation station downtown Kyiv. People in those cars were incinerated while they were on their way to work. The cruise missile struck power station just on the opposite side of that wall that you see there. You can see it. This is how people live in a country where their power has been taken away from them. And the Russians are working hard to make sure they have another cold, miserable winter. This is the map of Ukraine. What you see there in red is currently occupied by the Russians. That peninsula in the south is Crimea.
Завод.
I was in this town in May. It's the city the size of Columbus, slightly larger than Columbus. Dnipro. That night, me and a couple of Ukrainians. Mario, if this isn't going to work with the audio, then. This is a city twice the size of Columbus, Kharkiv. Martha, if this isn't going to work out, are you going to manually turn it on and off?
Yeah, we just can't talk with all the videos.
Oh,
I'm
awesome.
sorry.
No, that's cool.
We're learning here.
So imagine a city twice the size of Columbus where half of the city looks like this. This is just one random video that I took. Everything you see here, by the way, other than that missile strike, was taken with this phone, everything. And for those missile strikes, I was about 300 meters closer to the impact area than the Ukrainian who took that video from the balcony of his apartment. So that's how people live in Kharkiv, a city twice the size of Columbus that Photograph on the right is a shipping container that a person put over a manhole so that he and his family have a place to safely live in Kharkiv. I am going to bust through these slides real quickly. So that area you see on the map in purple was liberated last September from the Russians during the Eastern counteroffensive. So I draw your attention to the town of Izyum, which is about the size of Springfield, Ohio. That gentleman on the right is hugging his mother. He lives in Kharkiv, but he grew up in Izyum. He took us to Izyum just 5 days after that town was liberated from the Russians. And in that photograph there, he's hugging his mother, who he hadn't seen or spoken with over 6 months. In that photograph where he's hugging his mother, he's learning that his father died in his mother's arms during the Russian occupation. Died of pneumonia because the Russians did not allow any medical treatment of any Ukrainian civilians during the 6-month occupation. I got lots of stories. We just don't have time to talk about them today, but the stories of absolute terror of Russian occupation is, you can't make them up. That's me that same day at the notorious mass grave site of Izyum. So see if there's any feedback here. I'm good. So when I arrived at the mass grave site, the commandant of the investigation, who was national police, told me that they'd exhumed over 440 bodies. And out of that 440, only 19 were military-age males between the ages of 20 and 50. There were a couple dozen elderly folks that they had exhumed, but the vast majority were the mothers of Izyum. When we arrived at Izyum, the commandant or the commander of the garrison of the Ukrainian soldiers who had just moved into Izyum said, "You guys are going to see a lot of children here in Izyum, but you're going to see them with their grandparents. You're going to see them with elderly folks who volunteered to take them in, but you're not going to see them with their mothers and fathers. Their fathers are gone. We don't know where they're at, probably dead someplace, murdered someplace else, or maybe pressed into the Russian army, but their mothers are in this mass grave." And the mass grave is at a Russian army base, army post, encampment. I walked around it, counted about 2 battalions worth of roughly 1,000 Russian soldiers were there. When the Russians left, 24 hours after they retreated from Izyum, they rocketed and shelled it with canisters that open up about 300 feet above the ground, scattering these mines, which are designed to maim. They don't kill. I mean, they have a little charge, and they maim. So if you were to kick it, you would blow off the front of your foot. If you picked it up, which is if you were a child, picked it up, you would lose, the child would lose their hand distal to the elbow. And they look like toys. So if you can imagine a city with 20-hour-a-day curfew for 6 months, imagine Springfield, 20-hour-a-day curfew, 6 months. It's public parks, it's playgrounds, it's gardens, everything weeds this tall, with this stuff scattered all over the place. And you have to ask why. I returned to Ukraine. I left at the end of September, returned at the end of October. I draw your attention to the map again, where the southern part of Ukraine, that purple area, was liberated during the month of November last year. I got all over the battlefields as the Russians were retreating, and I had the good fortune to be with the commander of all the reconnaissance units, Ukrainian reconnaissance units in that part of the country, meaning they were at the very forward edge of the battle area. So I'm in his truck and he's taking me around areas where the Russians had just left 48 hours earlier. And he's showing this off because here is a commanding general of the Russian army. They were targeted with HIMARS strikes from his people doing all the targeting. That's him. So I drove around with him for several days, and imagine 6 counties, 6 Ohio rural counties, which were liberated, all rural, and dozens of villages which all look like this, because they were just a battlefield for several months. Kherson city, a city about the size of Columbus, was the only city captured by the Russians during the major invasion last year, and it was liberated last November. So these people are lined up for humanitarian assistance, food and water. And imagine a city the size of Columbus that went the entire winter last year without heat, running water. This lady I met in the square, we just don't have time to talk about it today, but there's dozens of stories. She's a middle school teacher in Kherson city. She told me that a third of her students gone, taken to Russia or Crimea. She doesn't know where. She just left with all these distraught parents. She said the Russians took everything out of her school, from the computers to the forks and spoons out of the school cafeteria. She said the Russians went from school to school in this large city, making and taking out all the Ukrainian language school books and making rituals of publicly burning them. This lady said the Russians looted this huge city on an industrial scale. They went from shop to shop, office buildings, factories, and loaded up everything they could into trucks that they then loaded onto barges. And this is a port city. So these barges, there's just this conveyor belt of barges just going away with Ukrainian, Russian loot onto Russia. And because Kherson City now is so close to the front lines, it is shelled with artillery daily and nightly. Scott, I didn't mention this because the introduction is only so much time for introductions. But when I retired, right after I retired, I went to the Ohio Fire Academy and went through the EMT and firefighter courses and joined a professional fire department up in Knox County, where my farm is. And so I brought 5 years of EMS experience to Ukraine, which is why I focused on the medical side when I arrived there. We spent 2 nights and days at the emergency room in one of the hospitals in Kherson, just to see if I could be of any help. We just don't have time to go through all these. So I returned to Ukraine in May, and if you ever heard of the Battle of Bakhmut, Bakhmut happens to be at least last year, was the most dangerous place on the planet. Just outside of Bakhmut, we're delivering some supplies in that town. I met this lieutenant. 4 days later, he texts a photograph to me of that shot in the flank. So in May, I draw your attention to the map again, the town of Liman. And if you go just east of there, you'll see the dark red line, which is the front line. That's a command post at the 0 line, one of many that I went to. These guys are at the battalion command post, getting drone feeds and protecting their soldiers and targeting Russians. So I'm going to start focusing more now on the medical side of what's going on in Ukraine. We don't know this. So that's me at a battalion aid station.
Hi.
We just don't have time. Listen to, so this is, at that battalion aid station, I interviewed these medical professionals. Just listen to what they had to say, if it comes through.
Talking with
Max, the lead medic for an infantry battalion of 500 soldiers,
and
his boss,
Dimitri,
who is in charge of all the combat medics in this battalion.
Max,
How many
killed in
killed in action in this one
battalion
battalion during the last 9 months?
About
100
100
And
cases.
I have none.
And
So Max, how
many wounded
during
have during the last 9 months?
About 200.
Out of how many soldiers?
Out of how many soldiers?
Скільки солдат? 500.
Ну, менше. За 280 заходили, але вони поповнюються.
За весь термін.
За весь термін,
About
так.
About
280.
280.
So that means
So that means almost 80% casualty battalion
Yeah,
during
Right.
9 months.
but people are going here.
New
New
people come,
people
yeah.
come.
Yeah,
Of course,
of
you
course,
get
you get
replacements,
replacements,
Yeah,
yes.
you get replacements.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good
Yeah.
work, guys.
Good work, guys. So I met their battalion commander. They started out with just under 500 soldiers. So they were like kind of like a National Guard unit. They were from one town in Ukraine. So this is me at what's called a stabilization point. So I was at that battalion for a couple of days, and we took a lot of artillery attack, including white phosphorus, which is like alien blood. You know, this stuff comes down and it burns right through body armor, right through flesh, right through bone. So I helped with a few casualties and then went to this stabilization point as the casualties were being evacuated.
So we're at
the Forward Surgical Hospital, the first stabilization point.
Doctor,
Doctor, you're in charge. How many casualties do you
on
treat
one
on
month
1 month on average?
Приблизно в середньому ви приймаєте тут поранених.
Середні показники на день у нас складають 80-90. Пік у нас був один десь 160. Отак, ну, якщо з такого розрахунку взяти, то на місяць у нас виходить багато.
The average amount of wounded militaries here from 80 to 90 per day. And there was one day when it was like a big maximum of how many soldiers? 160. So it means that there are a lot of people injured militaries who comes to that stabilization point.
80 or 90 casualties every single day, sometimes peaking to 160 for just a 2 brigade area, approximately of just 4,000 soldiers. Did anybody have trouble hearing that? Okay. So that's 20 miles of a 500-mile front, and they're getting that level of casualties daily. And that's before any Ukrainian counteroffensive began. So I returned to Ukraine at the beginning of November, just a few weeks ago. So I draw your attention to the map again. Right now, there's two, other than the Battle of Bakhmut, the Battle of Avdiivka and Robotyne are the two hottest spots on the front lines, and I went there. So this is Avdiivka. So it's kind of like the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. Other than they're not entirely encircled, but this is a crossroads town. It's strategic to the Ukrainians. If the Russians take this, then they have access to a larger highway network that reaches further west into Ukraine. So it's important for the Ukrainians to defend this crossroads town. But there's 35 to 40,000 soldiers that are all around this town. So I went to the outskirts of Avdiivka. This is a point where casualties are like that battalion aid station you saw where I interviewed the medic and his boss. This is the same the same setup here in Avdiivka. So medics stay here. This is where these medics have their bunks. It's also where medics will treat casualties. I show you this because you'll understand here in a moment when the medics explain why I showed you that video. I don't get this very often, but I had the gratification of all this hard work of also assembling medical supplies that were donated from local hospitals here in Columbus area. I reside in Upper Arlington. And then we got them over to Ukraine and had the gratification of actually getting them to the forward lines where they could be used. So you see that in the lower left photograph, the guy in the foreground is one of the two physicians at this stabilization point, just about 10 miles west of the Battle of Avdiivka. Listen to what he has to say.
We're in the Avdiivka area, which is arguably the most intense combat in all of Ukraine right now. The Russians are attempting to encircle and capture this town with about 40,000 enemy soldiers. So there's a huge volume of casualties that come through this one stabilization point for that entire battlefield. They all come through right here. I'm speaking with one of the only two doctors at the stabilization point. Doctor with the combat medic training, would be one of the top areas of training that combat medics need to be trained in better.
I can speak in Ukrainian. Що дякую вам за запитання. Перш за все, за те, що ви приїхали до нас.
Thank you very much for this question.
Thank you very much for this question, and thank you very much for your arrival.
If you wish to help us
If you wish to help us
and to help
our soldiers.
Дуже важливим є вміння
a very important skill of our
A very
combat
important
medics
skill of our combat medics
вчасно
is to work properly.
is to work properly with tourniquet conversion plan.
We still have problems
We still
with
have problems with
amputations
amputations that shouldn't happen,
і із-за невміння
and without lack of skill
and without lack of skills
and not confidence
and
of
not
our
confidence
medics
of our medics
to do this during
medical evacuation.
It would be very good
It would be very good if our medics had confident skill in these particular activities.
And during this long
period of medical evacuation from the front line to stabilization point,
for us it would be much more easier to provide professional medical help and care. And we would be sure that
a lot of these hands and legs would be saved.
And sometimes even it would be help much more to save its functionality.
I'm with Cass,
a combat medic at the only stabilization point for the huge battle of Avdiivka.
So Cass,
tell me about some of the problems we've got with combat medic training and how much needed. Why is it needed so desperately?
Our main problem is that Russia knows our evacuation routes as well as our CCPs. They target them with artillery. Therefore, we are forced to keep our communities in our care for several hours.
A lot of the medics
that we have are not trained adequately enough, need more thorough training, which could prevent a lot of needless death.
So what he's saying, the reason that I could even talk to a physician there was because we arrived just prior to first dark, last light. The casualties stack up at the front lines because they can only be evacuated at night, which is why I showed you that video of casualties being loaded into an ambulance in the dark. And this is what they do to ambulances, what the Russians target them. You take a close look, you'll see a litter in the back of that. That's a U.S. Army up-armored Humvee that was one of thousands given to Ukraine last year, used as the best they've got for an ambulance at the front. So I took that video at Advivka. That clinic that you saw where I was interviewing a physician, it's a clinic. And that same town, just a mile away, is the main hospital for that town. It's, again, a town about the size of Zanesville. This would happen 2 days after I left.
This is the hospital that the Russians bombed. It's November 22nd, 2023. And this is what they did. Every day they do this. They kill innocent people and terrorize Ukrainians.
So that is what's left of a hospital that was rocketed. And the lady that took that video and sent it to me via text, she is an American nurse practitioner who volunteered to go over there to help. So this is Avdiivka, now Robotyne. So Robotyne, and the town next to it, Verbova, is the one area in the Ukrainian counteroffensive that penetrated through Russian front lines. So that area in blue you see on the map is the Ukrainian advance, only about 10 miles into Russian lines. They're surrounded by Russians on high ground now. That's been in this state for 4 months as the Ukrainians continue to pound away and grind away against the Russian front line. This is Robotyne. So I'm in a pickup truck of a Ukrainian battalion commander. I should add it to this presentation because 4 days ago he texted a photograph of that truck destroyed by a Russian drone while they were in it. They survived. Here's some medics in Robotyne. Listen to what they have to say.
I'm with two combat medics at a casualty transfer point. Two medics and casualties coming out of the Robotyne Verbova area. Probably one of the toughest spots right now for combat in all of Ukraine. So we ask you, out of the medics in Ukraine, what percentage are
Хотів
trained?
запитати питання, який процент медиків, бойових медиків треновані достатньо
At the combat medic corpsman levels.
на уровні бойових медиків по основним навичкам?
Це важко сказати, бо в принципі
It's very hard to say, it depends
які люди
of what
приходять,
type of people comes in and goes out, because we have losses. 10, 15, maybe 20% are trained, it's the answer.
So, what are some of the problems that you're seeing with
Скажіть, будь ласка, які основні проблеми ви бачите
medic training versus tourniquet conversion?
в підготовці комбат-медиків в розрізі питання конверсії турнікетів?
проблема конверсії турнікетів.
The problem of tourniquet conversion really exists.
Через недостатньо
It's very low training level of medics, and also because of environment where they fight.
Через те, що не завжди може приїхати вчасно медик.
And we have very long period of time when a medic can show up.
Тому, на жаль, часто це призводить до втрат.
That's why very often we have the problems with amputation that didn't supposed to be happen.
Tell me about the delays in evacuation. Why are the delays taking place, and what are the Russians doing to the ambulances on the evacuation?
Скажите, пожалуйста, как проходит медицинская эвакуация, насколько часто попадают под обстрел машины, которые осуществляют медицинскую эвакуацию, и как воздействует противник на машины?
Машини евакуації знаходяться під постійними обстрілами, і через це ми вивозимо поранених переважно вночі.
So ambulances of medical evacuation, they are always a target and they always try to be hit. That's why we provide medical evacuations only during the night period of time.
На жаль, хлопці отримують поранення не тільки ближче до ночі, тому так часто буває, що пораненому треба досить тривалий час чекати до сірого чи до темного, поки ми зможемо.
And of course, our guys can be hit not only in night period of time, it can be during the day. That's why we have to wait till the night period of time to be possible to provide their medical evacuation.
How many hours delay does that cause for the evacuation of casualties? How many hours?
И насколько это может вообще затянуться?
По-різному буває, що цілий день по 6, по 8 годин. Буває таке, що якщо середньої тяжкості, хлопці чекають.
So it can be 6, it can be 8 hours easily, and even guys with the middle level of injury, they can wait this period of time till night will come.
Which underlies the absolute necessity of why these combat medics have to be trained thoroughly, because these casualties are in the care of medics for 6, 8, 10 hours before they can be evacuated for a doctor to see them. Okay, so I'll wrap this. We have got, at the Columbus Foundation, there is a fund that we're fundraising for. I'm the only fundraiser. So, and what this goes towards is this stuff. So I've got a $2 million budget, and we are, and we'll employ the funds to buy all of the equipment that essentially you would train a doctor. Venous mannequins, airway mannequins, cricothyrotomy mannequins, tension pneumothorax mannequins, multi-system trauma mannequins, and all the consumables that go with that. So when I became an EMT, I went through the tactical medical course because our fire department needed somebody skilled in tactical medicine. It's a 4-week course. I went through it twice during my 5 years there. So I know exactly what the curriculum is. So the Ukrainians, what they're doing is they're taking that exact same course, word for word, day for day, all 94 skills, and they're training their 27, they will train their 27,000 combat medics in it. And the problem is, as Scott mentioned when he introduced me, is 4 out of the 5 medical centers where Ukrainian medics were trained, where physicians were graduated as well, were destroyed last year. And then you had the Ukrainian army growing from this size to this size over the past 18 months, taking this many medic casualties because they have to expose themselves in combat. So you have, as one of the medics pointed out, 15–20% of the medics actually know what they're doing. And the big problem, and I'll just land it here, is not just avoidable deaths, but what I learned when I was in Ukraine, while working on this program, was the chief surgeon of Ukraine told me that 70% of the limb amputations are avoidable. And the problem is this tourniquet conversion issue that the physician and the medics talked about. And I in Kyiv, in another large city, during this past visit, I started noticing these amputations a little bit differently. They're all up here, and they're all right here, which is where medics are trained, soldiers are trained to apply the tourniquet, high and tight. But when you leave a tourniquet on for 6, 8, 10, 12 hours without converting it to a pressure dressing, which is what you're supposed to do, they're tourniquet happy over there in the first place, but importantly, you convert a tourniquet to a pressure dressing by you get a buddy here like Scott, untrained medic, but you slowly back off the tourniquet while me, the medic, apply a pressure dressing. And if that controls the bleeding, great, you take the tourniquet off. But when you leave the tourniquet on for that length of time, amputations are a necessity. And the Ukrainian amputation rate is horrendous. The British said that the Ukrainians in the first 6 months of this year had more amputations than the entire British Army during all of World War I. It's 70% avoidable. So that is why I'm doing what I'm doing and highly motivated to do it. I won't walk you through this because there's just lack of time, but once all this equipment is purchased and we buy it, and the Ukrainians set up this, which is 22 different facilities to train medics, and they're doing it right now. They're getting facilities ready, they're training their instructors. Half of them are going to be physicians, the other half are going to be experienced combat medics in a 2-month instructor course, the course that I went through this year here in the States. They will have the capacity then to train 27,000 medics in a 12-month period. And the next year, do it all over again, because in the Army, everything is remedial training, right? So that is what I'm doing, and I will be here to answer questions. I don't know how much time there is for questions now, but certainly I'll be around.
Thank you, Arnold, General Arnold. I really appreciate that. If you could take some time today or this week to think about those families in Ukraine and also the casualties all over, do that. And if there's anything you can do to help General Arnold, please do. I know that Scott will have some information, that contact information that we can do that. So next, I would like to call up our Assistant District Governor, Ned Clark. He's going to recognize all the Polio Plus and Club 125 Club donors.
Kind of a tough act to follow. Thank you, General, for everything you're doing. Okay. So I'd like to recognize everybody who's contributed to the 125 Club. And again, that's just a quick reminder, that's at least $100 to the International Foundation, the Rotary International Foundation, and at least $25 to support Polio Plus. So, we have pens.
I do not have them. I'm so sorry.
Okay, I don't have pens, but promise you'll get it. So number one on the list, and in our hearts, Sandra Lynn Knaser. Okay. Callaway, is Callaway here this morning? No, okay. Reverend Nancy P. Day. Ockhour. Thank you very much. You would remain standing, please.
Okay.
Sorry, you have to go first, but somebody has to. Banana. Steve Heiser. David Allspot. Galen Graham. And Tim Maggie. Thank you all much.
As our club's Rotary Foundation chair, I want to thank everybody for contributing to Polio Plus, which is this year's District Governor David Poole. That's one of his major goals is to have